Over the last few months, the United States has been quietly carrying out lethal military strikes in the Caribbean. No vote from Congress, no public debate, and almost no transparency for the American people. These strikes are being described as counter drug operations. But when you slow down and look at what's actually happening, something much more troubling comes into focus. This isn't just about drugs. It's about how easily military force can be normalized when it happens far from home, and how quickly democratic oversight can disappear when the public isn't paying attention.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has said that airstrikes by the United States of America on boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific violate international human rights law.
According to reporting by Reuters, U.S. forces have carried out at least 22 strikes on vessels described as suspected drug trafficking boats since September of last year. At least 87 people have been killed. Those are the confirmed numbers. What we don't have is nearly as clear. The administration has not released public evidence showing that every one of these vessels posed an imminent threat. It hasn't released footage. It hasn't released legal memos. And it hasn't explained case by case why lethal force was necessary instead of arrest, interdiction, or prosecution. That gap matters. Because when the government uses lethal force in secret, accountability doesn't just weaken, it vanishes. The Trump administration points to existing counter-drug authorities under U.S. law. On paper, those laws allow the military to assist with surveillance, intelligence, and monitoring in drug interdiction efforts. But here's the critical distinction. Those authorities were written for support roles. They were not written to authorize a sustained campaign of airstrikes against suspected traffickers at sea. Legal scholars and former military officials have been clear on this point. Support is not the same thing as combat. Congress never voted to authorize a new theater of lethal military operations in the Caribbean, and yet that's effectively what's happening. When force expands beyond what lawmakers approved, the question isn't just legal, it's democratic. One reason this has flown under the radar is language. Notice how often the administration uses the word cartels. Once you apply that label, something changes. Law enforcement becomes war, suspects become targets, and due process quietly drops out of the conversation. Calling something a cartel lowers the political cost of violence. It primes the public to accept lethal force without evidence, and it shifts decision-making power away from courts and toward the executive branch. This is not new. It's the same rhetorical move used in the so-called war on terror, just repackaged for the drug war.
The U.S. military, as I mentioned, nobody better in the world at mapping networks, identifying who's connected to who inside terrorist organizations. It's just the media is used to hearing that when it pertains to Afghanistan and Iraq and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But if you reframe how you understand the world in our own hemisphere, that's exactly what these foreign terrorist organizations are. And so we will track them, we will map them, we will network them, and we will hunt them and kill them.
International human rights organizations have taken notice. The United Nations Human Rights Office has warned that these strikes are incompatible with international human rights law. Human Rights Watch has described them as potential extrajudicial killings at sea. That does not mean a court has ruled the strikes illegal, but it does mean serious concerns are being raised by credible institutions whose job is to monitor abuses of state power. Under human rights law, lethal force is supposed to be a last resort. It is justified only to protect life, not to punish suspected crimes. Targeting suspected criminals absent an imminent threat is heavily contested, and that's exactly why transparency matters.
Over 60 people have reportedly been killed in a continuing series of attacks carried out by U.S. armed forces against boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific since early September, in circumstances that the UN Human Rights Chief says find no justification in international law. These attacks and their mounting human cost are unacceptable.
Under the War Powers Resolution, Congress is supposed to authorize or rein in sustained military actions. That's not a technicality. It's one of the core checks on executive power in a democracy. But so far, Congress has largely stayed silent. And silence, in moments like this, functions as permission in practice, even if not in law. Only after investigative reporting did some lawmakers begin asking questions, requesting legal justifications, requesting strike footage, requesting clarity. Oversight should come before force, not after bodies start to pile up. This is the part that's hardest to talk about and the easiest to ignore. When we talk about boats and operations, we abstract away the people involved, but every one of those 87 deaths was a human being, someone with a family, someone with a story, someone who will never get a trial or a chance to surrender or a chance to be proven innocent. Even if some were engaged in serious crimes, that doesn't erase the moral weight of killing without due process. What troubles me most is how easy it is for this to happen quietly, how little national conversation there's been, how normalized it starts to feel when force is used far from our shores. That should give all of us pause. You don't have to be soft on drug trafficking to be alarmed by this. This isn't about whether drugs are a real problem. They are. It's about how a government chooses to respond. If a president can conduct lethal strikes without clear authorization, evidence, or oversight, and face no immediate consequences, that power doesn't stay contained. It becomes available to this administration and the next. That's how democracies erode, not all at once, but through normalized exceptions that slowly become the rule. History shows us that practices normalized abroad don't stay abroad. Techniques used overseas often come home. Language used to justify foreign force gets reused domestically. And once the public accepts secrecy and executive discretion in one arena, it becomes easier to accept it elsewhere. That's why civil liberties advocates have been warning about this pattern for decades, and why ignoring it now would be a mistake. This story isn't about boats in the Caribbean. It's about power. In a democracy, force is supposed to be accountable. Authority is supposed to be limited. And secrecy is supposed to raise alarms, not excuses. When military action happens without consent, clarity, or oversight, the question isn't just, is this legal? It's who decided, who watched, and who gets to say no. Those questions don't go away just because the action happens far from home. They define whether a democracy is still functioning at all.
Thanks for spending a few minutes digging into this with me. If you want more grounded, progressive commentary without the outrage bait, subscribe and stick around. Every time you watch, share, and engage, it helps build a community that believes democracy is worth understanding and defending. I'll see you in the next video.